Welcome to Paper 1, Module 1 of AQA GCSE Sociology Families. Before you begin, make sure you have all your equipment ready. Are you going to need paper, coloured pens to organise, pencils, rulers, perhaps your easy guides or revision guides, and then decide how you're going to organise your notes. Are you going to use spider diagrams, which relate to all the different views? Maybe you want to divide a piece of paper into four, put four headings in each corner, such as family types, marriage, divorce and change, theoretical perspectives, social stratification of families. That way, once you fill the four parts of the paper, you're keeping it to condensed and simple notes. Also, make sure you have something to eat and drink, that you can take regular breaks and you're relaxed before you begin. What is a family? Families are something which is integral to sociology because it's integral to people. And how sociologists see the family and define a family can vary quite substantially. Essentially, you want to think of the idea of socialization. Who raises you? Where do they raise you? And what does this mean? That transition between being a child to an adult is done in the social setting of a family usually. Now, there are lots of different family types, and how those family types are seen by different sociologists will vary. A household is a house where people live, so you can possibly not be in a family but live in a house with other people. Generally though, we're talking about childhood into adulthood, so remember that. Whether your parents are married or not, whether the people you live with are your parents, will dictate how you were raised, how you were socialised. So cohabitation can be who you live with. Family diversity refers to the different types of families within a society, such as nuclear, lone parent, extended, etc. Also, you may want to consider reconstituted families or blended families. The colloquial term for this is step family usually. And what this tells us about society. So often you'll be asked about family types in terms of change over time. This means you may get statistics or graphs. You may get a question where you have to show what has happened over time, and usually the change from the 50s or so when the Functionalists were writing through to the modern day. So that's debates around the nuclear family and how central it is. Family diversity refers to all the different types of families found in the UK. Often we think of the nuclear family, such as The Simpsons, as a dominant family, a married male and female with children living in one house. The Rappaports were a married couple who saw that family life was changing in Britain. Although the most common type of family is the nuclear family, or the most dominant at least, it seemed to be under threat when they were writing in the early 80s. Now this could be due to divorce, it could be due to death, it could be due to different norms and values. Obviously this challenges the Functionalists of the 50s. So the Rappaports described 5 different types of family diversity. Organisational, such as who's in the family, what are their roles. Cultural, so the difference between maybe the religion of a family, the ethnic origin, how perhaps a traditional European family may be the nuclear family that we all think of, but in an Asian family particularly, patriarchy tends to be more pronounced, so the eldest male will have all of the power, which is slightly different to the husband or father figure having the power. Class, middle class families tend to have different values to working class families, as noted by the Rappaports. Middle class families tend to want to raise their children in a household that's more child-centred and offers more choice and opportunity, perhaps because of money, perhaps because of sensibilities, and the Rappaports argue that working class families tend to be about discipline and children conforming. Life course, that can really talk about the move from when a child is a baby, and traditionally a mother would stay at home and raise the child, through their progression to school, through to the empty nest, when all the children leave the family home and just the parents are left. And cohort can be about who else is in the family, family size, generationally as well, from parent to child to grandparents and extensions beyond that. Chester was the person who criticised the Rappaports. He said that essentially families haven't really changed. The parents do the parenting and children still behave as children. Therefore, their definitions and the Rappaports' way of looking at the family was essentially their own construct and not necessarily realistic or anything more than common sense being put into certain boxes. Reasons for family diversity. You may want to think about the law and how that's affected the family. Divorce, marriage, those are two things which you will probably get a question on, which will be a source of some sort. Quite commonly, charts, graphs with the rates of marriage and divorce in them over time. Think as well about the Equal Pay Act and how that's affected women going to work, and the changes in the 60s, technology such as contraception, and you may want to consider same-sex marriage and society's attitudes towards homosexuality. How in the 2000s, essentially, civil partnerships became a homosexual equivalent for a lot of people. They were then rejected, and gay marriage itself became legalised in the last decade or so. Changing social values and attitudes, therefore, can be shown by reflecting these changes to the media portrayals, to the laws, and how society generally accommodates or excludes certain groups, such as homosexuals. Single parents and benefits in the welfare state are often stigmatised by the new right, particularly, occasionally functionalists, and to some extent feminists. The roles that women play, who are usually single mothers, as single families as well, can be a cause of hot debate and stigma and labelling. Obviously, the employment opportunities within a family, when we talk about the gender pay gap, that's often accounted for by women staying at home to look after children for a period of time. This obviously affects the amount of money they earn in that period, it affects their pension contribution, and it affects the family's way of organising themselves. The longer life expectancy in Britain means that once you get an empty nest scenario, you have parents living longer. Also, people may remarry much later, and can this be accounted for in the statistics? Decline in religion and secularisation. Well, when you talk about gay marriage, the debate around the church and whether they should accept it or not is something you may want to mention here. The fact that people aren't religious anymore and they live longer means they're getting married later. It's no longer common to get married at 18 or get married in your early 20s at least, leave home and start a family. People live with their parents longer. People go to university more often. People have different life chances and different outcomes now, where marriage perhaps isn't the priority that it used to be. And this can be seen in gender norms too, as well as gender roles. Women no longer are expected to go straight to be a housewife, nor to aspire to it as they grow up. So we can see all of these debates in reasons for family diversity. There's a lot here that you can talk about throughout your exam, so do take this section and really work on getting as many details out as you can. The nuclear family is seen as the normal family. It's assumed when you say family often you mean a nuclear family. Therefore, when we see a heterosexual married couple with children and think of those as a family, we're reinforcing certain stereotypes. Functionalists are very, very in favour of the nuclear family, the new right even more so. They believe this is the best way to raise children. They believe that it's what society wants, hence it's the most dominant family type. Edmund Leach came up with the idea of the cereal packet family, and you can see this as an extension of the media and how the media portrays what a perfect family should be. A mum, a dad, a son and a daughter usually. Anne Oakley criticised this heavily. A lot of her research as a feminist looked at the nuclear family as a way of constraining women, resigning them to housework, and housework not being acknowledged or valued by society. So the nuclear family is really important. It's often a good starting point when you talk about any aspect in the exam, because you can compare every other family type, every change to the nuclear family as a starting point. Therefore, you may want to look at how functionalists and feminists have such opposing views and why the functionalists and the new right are so in favour of the nuclear family. Alternatives to the family. This section is where we look at a more modern phenomena of people who move out of the family home, but they don't go into the traditional role of getting married and settling down into their own home perhaps, and there could be lots of reasons for that. People obviously are not only getting married later, but they're having more varied careers. They're going off to university where they may share a house with other students, and this may delay traditional patterns of movement. The example in the textbook, not only of shared housing for various reasons among students and young professionals, can be combined with a kibbutz. This is specific to Israel, but essentially means a communal farm based on the ideas of Marxism coming out of the post-war era, where people went to Israel and farmed, living together, working together, and all resources, all money was shared, if you like, for the good of the farm. And this was in a very different way to many societies. And you may want to think about the implications of that. How old are these people going to be? What kind of responsibilities and commitments are they going to have? How long may they stay there? Then at the end of people's lives, if we look at life cycle diversity, you may think about residential homes. How people end up there, often because they've become widowed or widowers, often because they can't care for themselves and they don't have a family to live with. If you think about the impact of immigration on family types, and the idea that in some cultures grandparents and older members of the family will move in and be looked after because there were no alternatives in other countries, residential homes offer a good point to talk about there. When you see statistics on things like single person households, for example, you may want to question the age, the class, the circumstances, because if the statistics don't give you that, you can talk around how single person household can be a fairly meaningless term unless you know who that single person is and at what stage of their life they're at. The last thing you may want to consider, particularly living in Manchester, is the amount of flats that are being built and the way in which we no longer just build family homes in suburban areas, particularly in city centres. A lot of family homes are not being built. It's high-rise flats designed for single person households or house shares. And that may tell us something about norms and values and diversity across the country between urban and rural areas and those in between. Families in a global context. I alluded to this previously, but immigration into Britain has arguably changed the family diversity within Britain. From different parts of the world come different people, different cultures, different ethnicities, and with them different expectations around what a family should be. So culture may be how you explain this. Remember, in your exam you might want to talk about specific examples, such as the rate of single parents differing between cultures, the ideas of matriarchy in Caribbean culture, where the woman is the head of the household and she dictates family life, and the male has power in other spheres, or in Asian cultures, where patriarchy is passed down no matter the child's age. If they are the oldest male, they are deferred to, they have a sense of power within the family. And then obviously the traditional British nuclear family, however you interpret that, you may want to use that as a comparison. And this comes back to the idea of nuclear families, single parent families, life course diversity, all of those issues we've discovered previously. You may want to make comparisons. Be very careful here not to just stereotype and make lazy assumptions. Talk about these as broad picture ideas, and obviously there's lots of detail that can be expanded upon that perhaps sociology doesn't take into account when talking about huge groups of people. Functionalism and the family. If you learn one theoretical perspective, I recommend it be functionalism for this module. Functionalism really talks straight into how we see the nuclear family as the norm because they favour it. And this comes down to the idea of primary socialisation, the idea that families directly teach us how to live, how to act, how to fit into society, what's expected of us. When Parsons said that the American family has two basic functions, really he's talking about Western society as a whole. Primary socialisation of children and stabilising their adult personalities. Those are two of the functions of a family. Murdoch saw it in four ways: sexual gratification, economic provision, providing money, educating, which is essentially primary socialisation, and reproductive, physically having children to carry on the family, to carry on society. Parsons also came up with the idea of the warm bath theory. the idea that the nuclear family is an escape from work. So you may want to play on that with Marxist ideas and the idea that work is so terrible we need the family to escape from it. So Murdoch and Parsons are really where you want to focus your efforts. You may want to talk about Durkheim and the transition of norms and values, link that all into primary socialization, and think about how effectively can a family stabilize someone's adult personality. Is that the only factor at play here? That's really linking to the other modules such as education, crime and deviance, social stratification. Obviously, feminists and Marxists are not consensus sociologists, they're conflict sociologists. They have huge disagreements with Murdoch, with Parsons, with Durkheim. So you may want to think about consumerism and the Marxist idea that families are conditioned through the media, through society, to further capitalism. Feminist ideas about housework are probably a stronger criticism here, because it shows how women are exploited, how expectations for men and women are different, and how these are passed on and reinforced. Think about nature versus nurture, think about the toys children play with, the choices adults make for their children, and how these can be gendered, and what this tells us from both a functionalist and feminist point of view. Alternative theories on the functions of the family. Essentially, this is a discussion about Marxism and feminism and how they disagree with functionalists. Marxists, through the ideas of Zaretsky, would see families as being directly influenced by capitalist society. So you may want to think about how different it was for a family in the Victorian era particularly, where kids were put to work as soon as possible, family numbers were huge, and essentially kids were seen as having to pay their own way and contribute to the family. And you can see this through capitalist societies changing, that family types and family number has changed too. He says that there's an illusion of private life, that when we go home, we then go and buy more. We buy things to make our homes better, to comfort ourselves, that family essentially becomes a cushion for the individual, particularly the parents, and also it props up the capitalist economy. The ideas of Delphi and Leonard talk about exploitation in the family. It's men, not capitalists, who benefit from women's labour, and they mean domestic labour here, so housework. The double, the triple shift where women work at home and outside of the home and look after children. This is all areas that you may want to talk about and compare when you think of all the different ways in which feminists could criticise the nuclear family particularly, but all family types. If you think about a single parent family and the fact that it's usually single mothers with children, again, this may be a stereotype, but it's important distinctions that you want to make here. If it is a single mother who has to do child rearing, who has to do the housework, how do they then earn money? Either they go out to work and there's more exploitation there of women from a feminist point of view, or they receive some sort of benefits, which is something the New Right would heavily criticise. These make for really fascinating debates, and if you can get those basic ideas, you can talk about anything in your essays, in my opinion, anything in your longer answer exam questions. Relationships in families. When talking about how relationships have changed in families, you need to take into consideration what was going on at the time. Before industrialisation, families either owned land or worked on land for other people. There was very little education, so children would work from a young age and families would be self-sufficient. In industrial times, as I alluded to previously, Victorian families would have to be large numbered because of disease, because of life expectancy, for all different types of reasons, and children would expect to contribute. Contemporary families today, you may want to consider, well, who provides? Is this more like the functionalist idea? Is it more like the idea that parents are there to provide money for the children as well as all the other needs? How do parents respond to each other? What's the role of the mum and the dad? Is there a mum and a dad, etc.? And if we get into things like symmetrical families and the ideas of Young and Wilmot, how equal and how shared are not just housework, but parenting responsibilities and other duties? And what does this tell us about patriarchy? How does the upper elements of society, the elites, the rich and the powerful, influence the family? Because Because if you think about someone, say like the Kardashians and perhaps Kim and Kanye in their relationship, how does a celebrity couple like that and what they do and how they raise their children and how they're seen to do it influence everyday people and how they do the same thing? Obviously, technology, the internet and use of computers can also be something you may want to talk about. We live in an age now where children grow up with the internet, with screens in front of them. What does that mean for the family unit compared to, say, the 1950s, where everyone would sit around the radio or the television set together? Families no longer eat together, as what research suggests. What does that mean for norms and values as well as attitudes? There's a lot to unpack in this if you want to go into a lot of detail, but essentially, keeping it simple, you want to talk about the changes of children just being part of the family and expected to contribute to child-centeredness, the rise of the teenager in the 1950s, and all of the cultural changes that come along with that. Marriage. Marriage is a really important topic. It's something which is in the news a lot. It's something which people define themselves by. And it's always been seen as when people start a family. People were expected to get married first, then start a family, and they'd live out the rest of their lives based upon that premise. So we really want to look at how important is marriage today. So in contemporary society, marriage is declining. Marriage has been declining for a long time now. But you have the divorce law from the 1960s and different attitudes. You also have homosexual marriage, meaning perhaps that marriage is redefined and the importance of marriage is redefined. So you want to be making comparisons between the traditional nuclear family, the traditional expectations of society, and what that means for marriage. The introduction of gay marriage, immigration, and the concept of arranged marriage are areas where you may want to look at the influence of religion on society, the influence of religion on norms and values, and the knock-on effect for marriage. Monogamy and serial monogamy essentially refers to being with one partner. So you can be married more than once, but you may stay faithful to that partner. You may divorce and remarry and still have what's known as serial monogamy, or you may remarry later in life because of death or for whatever reason may be. If you think of the attitudes of, say, the Catholic Church to marriage and how the Catholic Church may be seen as a minor role in British society compared to other European countries, you can talk about the influence of other areas, other ideas, other beliefs coming in, and the fact that people do still get married is something that really can be discussed. One last thing may be the cost of marriages, and is marriage a class-based thing now? Is it something because it's prohibitively expensive, people don't do so much in the lower classes? Research may suggest that in some areas, but really you want to focus on it from the point of view of what it means to people, and coming back to the idea of the nuclear family always for the exam. Divorce. Obviously with marriage, we then need to look at divorce and why the pattern has changed so much since 1945. As you can see from the graph, divorce has massively increased between the 60s and 70s when divorce was first legalised and widely accepted, and kind of steadily dropped again in the 2000s. Now, has this dropped because less people are getting married, so there's less people to get divorced, or is this to do with the idea that people are trying to make their marriages work longer? This can be quite complex, and the influence of religion may have waned. We may have more secular society, so getting divorced is not seen as a big deal, and neither is marriage. The traditional family functions that we talked about with Murdoch, with Parsons, and the criticisms of the feminists and the Marxists may not be so relevant today, and this may be an area where marriage and divorce rates can be shown. You will get a question on marriage and divorce rates, I'm sure of this in some form, and often an item such as the graph could be one to analyse. So you may want to talk about the different elements in society and what that may show us about norms and values. So this can be social attitudes reflected in the numbers. Again, you may want to think about the rights of women. Early on, women had no rights. They were owned by men, essentially, when it came to marriage. So only really men could divorce women. And women may rely on their man as a breadwinner previous to the 1960s. So they may not want to get divorced regardless of things like infidelity or domestic violence or the dark side of the family, as the feminists would call it. So when discussing divorce, you're also discussing marriage. And you want to talk about the issues that come out of that. So read any question on divorce very carefully and think about what the numbers actually can show us for sure rather than what they might show us, and make that distinction very clear to the examiner. Consequences of divorce. Obviously, divorce means a change in family type, a change in life course diversity, and it means a change in parenting and socialization. So taking functionalist ideas as a starting point and a place for comparison, you may want to look at what lone parent families signify and how they're treated by the media, how they're seen by people, and what it does for the children. How children may not receive the socialization of a nuclear family, how the inclusion of step parents, step families, and movements in location and jobs of parents, as well as changes in income, can massively affect everyday life for children. So you may want to think about this again in terms of rates of divorce, rates of marriage, and then link that to different sociologists. Feminists and Marxists may have very different views on lone parent families because of the makeup and the gender roles. So again, if you talk in broad stereotypes, that's okay, but be sure to make that evident and be sure to show that you know there's more to this topic. Theories about divorce. Obviously, functionalists are overwhelmingly positive about the family, the nuclear family in particular, and with it marriage. So it may seem odd to suggest they'd be positive about divorce. But one functionalist argument may be the aspect that divorce leads to happier people, and by not staying in a dysfunctional family, that overall is better for society, as well as the people involved in that family. Marxists might see it as a struggle over resources. People may cheat on their spouses, on their husbands and wives, because someone they cheat with has more money, has a better job, has better prospects. This may lead to divorce. Feminists may see it as the inequalities between men and women being too much. Women may see their husband as no good, as exploitative, lazy, however that may be, and therefore want to find a more suitable arrangement or something which benefits them more. This is obviously really difficult because something as personal as marriage and personal as divorce can be really hard to stereotype and can be really hard to make assumptions about huge groups of people. Therefore, when talking about why divorce occurs, you may want to make the distinction between general ideas such as infidelity, such as resources, such as personal happiness, and the specific cases. So functionalists, Marxists and feminists would all view divorce from wildly different angles and with wildly different conclusions. Therefore, you can make comparisons and you can look at divorce as something fairly neutral, and then from that explore what functionalists, feminists, Marxists believe. In the exam, always use theories about divorce to compare with statistics and to compare with other wider ideas that you've studied, because on their own, unless it's a short question like a 3 or 4 marker, it's going to be very difficult to talk about theories of divorce confidently. Conjugal roles. Conjugal roles immediately conjure up the image of the relationship between men and women in the family, in the household. Obviously that doesn't apply to single parent families, to lone parent families, to homosexual couples and other types of families. So conjugal roles, really you need to make a distinction between the nuclear family and other family types. So you may look at the 1950s idea of segregated conjugal roles, of the woman taking care of the man doing the more physical labour around the house, the types of chores men and women do, such as do women cook and clean and men maybe take the bins out and do the DIY. You may want to think about the dual burden from the feminist point of view, and how Oakley talks about the nuclear family providing an area to exploit women, and these conventional ideas, the strains for women, the strains of power, that men really benefit. They benefit even in subtle ways. So from a feminist point of view, it is entirely gender based, and you can make a comparison between feminists and functionalists really well here. It's quite hard really to see a Marxist perspective being an obvious one to go to in the exam. So I would really stick between the ideas of Oakley and her work on conventional families and housework and domestic labour, and what that means for men and women, and functionalist ideas, and make comparisons there. The symmetrical family. The symmetrical family springs from the functionalist ideas of Young and Wilmot. These were done in the 1970s, 1973, so you may want to place it in the context of that time. Obviously, divorce had become more commonplace, laws had changed, society had changed, and Young and Wilmot looked at the Greater London and surrounding areas, which may not be typical of all of the UK. You might want to think about the age of the families as well. Is it likely that a younger family are going to be more inclined to be symmetrical rather than an older, more traditional nuclear family with segregated roles? So Young and Wilmot, perhaps they were showing a change in society that was taking place then, but how effective has that change been? Is it still the case today that married couples are symmetrical, or even families where there's no marriage but they live together, cohabitation? Stratified diffusion is the other key idea, and it sounds very complicated, but essentially it's the influence of the upper class. I alluded to this earlier, but what do celebrities, what do powerful people do in their households, in their family types, which may influence other people, either through the media, through trends, through changing norms and values, and a trickle-down effect, if you like. Once rich and famous and powerful people get divorced, you may argue, well, that would inspire others lower down in society to get divorced. Making claims like that would be interesting in an exam, but you'd have to back it up and perhaps suggest that the statistics may not bear that out entirely, or there may be other reasons. But essentially, when we come to Young and Wilmot, is this idea that housework is shared. And obviously you can compare that really nicely with feminists, with Oakley, with Delphi and Leonard, and look at all the other ideas we've discussed previously. Changing relationships within families. You really want to be answering the question how relationships in families have changed over time. We've talked about the impact of pre-industrial, industrialisation and contemporary society in the makeup of families. But think about this in terms of what goes on behind closed doors. What's the status of women in society? How has the contraceptive pill, the Divorce Act, the rights of women changed in society? And the ideas of domestic violence. Women can now get away from abusive partners much easier. There are much higher profile campaigns, much higher profile understanding of domestic violence. And you may want to talk about the rise in domestic violence towards men. And has that actually changed, or has reporting of that changed? And you can link this obviously to our crime unit. You can think about gender roles here and huge changes in society in terms of identity. Changing relationships in the family is often seen as the negatives. And obviously this plays into feminist narratives really nicely and argues against functionalist narratives. So you may want to look at those two areas and compare again here. The power relationships could be economic, they could be about domestic labour, they could be about culture, they could be subtler than that. So you want to think about, is this different in working class, middle class, upper class families? Is this different based on gender? Is this different based on ethnicity and background, religion, aspects like that? Who earns the money? How is the money distributed? what essentially the day-to-day living in various households could be like because of changing relationships within the family. And then bring it back to the children, the ideas of teenage identity, culture, child-centeredness, and the impact of technology, what this means for all members of the family, all generations of the family, and how you can link that back to the sociology. Functionalist and Marxist theories about conjugal roles. Functionalists and Marxists will obviously see conjugal roles in very different ways. Functionalists will see them as benefiting society. Whatever conjugal roles a family suits, both individuals must consent, both individuals must see it as beneficial for them, their family, and then by virtue of that, society benefits because you have happy, functional families, for want of a better word. Marxists would see it as satisfying capitalism, that families make sacrifices so men particularly can go out and work and earn the most money. Women can provide for the family and still perhaps have an income. This is complex, so stick very much to simple ideas that we've already covered so far. You may want to think of it in terms of who does what, how does it benefit them, and if we're looking at a functionalist idea, what does that do for society? If we're looking at a Marxist idea, what does that do for capitalism? That way, when you're talking in essays and in questions, you can show both sides easily, and you can find simple criticisms too. It's not something you particularly need to worry about, but with feminism there's a lot more depth and there's a lot more key terms and ideas that you can pick out and really work with. From functionalist and Marxist ideas, it's more general and broader than that. So just bear that in mind when it comes to the exam. Feminist theories about conjugal roles is probably the most interesting part of this topic. So feminists obviously see conjugal roles as exploiting women. Housework has always been marketed by the media towards women. Adverts to make women's life easier. Technology to make women's life easier, such as the dishwasher, the washing machine, the vacuum cleaner, etc., etc. And if you think about today's adverts, how often do they feature a woman? How often is the man a peripheral character in the advert? How often is it about being a good mother and living up to that stereotype or that expectation of society? Men's role is often seen not really in the same way. Men are not seen as responsible or capable of parenting and housework in the same way. Oakley looks at this in 1982 study Conventional Family, and she's given a recent interview following this up where she talks about the way that housework isn't valued by society. It's expected, it's seen as a norm. Women aren't paid for it because it's not valuable. Yet obviously if housework didn't happen, a family couldn't function properly. So there's a tension there, and we've seen this throughout the module so far. This is something that Oakley talks of in terms of strain on relationships, strain on control, strain on who does what. So feminists are obviously very, very critical about conjugal roles. They would even reject someone like Young and Wilmot's shared roles rather than segregated roles, and see that not a lot has really changed for most people, particularly for most women. Therefore, feminism and functionalism throughout this module is the main area of contrast, of comparison, so use that wisely. When you're in the exam, obviously making reference to Oakley as the main feminist and Delphi and Leonard would be sensible, and then following that up with Parsons, Murdoch, and to a lesser extent Durkheim. If you can look at those different areas and show how conjugal roles particularly tell us a lot about how a family works, you will do very, very well indeed. That concludes Paper 1, Topic 1, Families. Make sure that you're going to start your very first exam with this module, so don't spend too much time on it. Obviously think about a mark a minute as your rough guidance for timing. Families is an area which is very popular. A lot of students really enjoy it because obviously you can compare it to your own life very easily. So use common sense throughout, give real life examples, focus on functionalism and feminism, and talk in terms of what a family does and what's the point of a family. Why do we choose to live in a family? If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below, email me directly, or see me in class. Thank you very much.